Hi everyone. I see that you're slowly gathering for our live. I'm Katia and I'm engagement coordinator here at CFWIJ. It's a pleasure, and today we'll have a really special, amazing guest, but we'll come to it shortly once she joins us. Yes. Hello. Hey, sorry. Okay, my guest is here, I guess. Hello. Hi,
Hi.
Khusbu. Hi, it's really great to see you. And I see that you're like in much better like environment or like background that I have. I mean, like I'm just sitting in my living room, so it's nothing special about that.
Well, the downside is that somebody decided to start mowing their lawn right now. So
Yeah, it always does, right? Like as I mentioned, that I'm afraid that somebody will gonna drill in the walls soon because neighbors like to do that. But yeah,
I know.
we'll see. And like, where are you right now? Like,
I'm in
which city?
California, in
California.
Carlsbad, in San Diego.
Great. Hence the weather. I'm so jealous. Here it's like already gloomy and nothing that I can expect from October actually. Nothing better.
I
Yeah, but
know.
yeah, like we all need to live with it, right? So yeah, so like how are you? You're fine? You're great?
I'm fine. Yeah, thank you. I'm fine. How are you?
Perfect. So like I guess I'm fine. I'm super excited that we can talk right now. And like so like little introduction to our audience. Like we're having a live today with amazing Khusbu Shah, award-winning journalist and editor-in-chief of the Fuller Project. Khusbu writes for various media outlets, the biggest media outlets in the world, basically, and like mostly about intersection of race, politics, social justice, gender, and just to mention few, but like a lot, and like amazing experience. And I'm really happy to talk and chat about your experience, like your work at the Fuller Project, and like the insights on coverage on women in media and also women journalists and their situation in the industry as well. So for those who happen to not be familiar with the Fuller Project, like firstly, I would like to all of you to invite you to like go and check the website, but like I can also say like few words, and then Khusbu will tell me if I introduced everything correctly. So like just a word that this is a non-profit newsroom dedicated to objective reporting on women and creating opportunities for women journalists to go somewhere to report, to find loopholes, which topics, for example, are not covered and should be covered. And you basically make this link and enable women journalists to like strive for the topics and go there. Yeah, and then you manage to like basically sell it and like present it to the biggest media outlets. So it can be published and get the gather the bigger outreach, I would say. So did I miss something? I guess like was it okay?
That was great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So like I would like to start shortly from the Fuller Project, obviously. So like as we all know, the like it's not the news that women are underrepresented when it comes to covering this subject that gather the massive audience, or like they make the biggest headlines, you know, the politics, international politics, security, and so on. Basically they just push to some entertainment, let's say, or like maybe let's say maybe topics were not that widely recognized as serious, right? So we all know that. So I would actually, since the Fuller Project creates so many opportunities, and like I would like to start from something positive, before we start complaining, right? I would say that, like, from your experience also, like, as the editor-in-chief right now at the Fuller Project, what opportunity, your observations, like what opportunities you see for women, like way the sense is like what are the areas where women can go and report, and what are these areas also, like, you know, from your experience at the Fuller Project?
I mean, women can go. I mean, women can report everywhere, in my opinion, and in and I
Understood.
hope, yeah, as I would hope. But so, when you talk about that, it's difficult to separate what's happening behind the scenes in journalism, right, and what's happening on paper, on radio, on camera, because representation, meaning like the people who are covering the stories and who are overseeing the stories, matter as much as who is being covered. And so one's perspective and their life experience, to some extent, it shapes how you see certain stories and angles and the full story. And and as like, we're seeing a very, very large, very public media reckoning around not only race, but also, I think, to some extent, gender, and and certainly in the U.S. media industry. And and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say most newsrooms are predominantly male and white, especially at the highest levels. And so that affects the type of stories that we tell about women and how we see them. And so one way that we really look at a story is, okay, if we're telling a story about women and climate change, who are our experts? Are they women? Are they women who have on the ground experience? And are we looking at all the right angles? Are we looking at angles, and are we looking at the story from just not the traditional way that women are covered? Also, in terms of, I think it's really important to look at how we speak about women in our reporting as well. Are they if they're the center of the story, are they survivors rather than victims, for example? And so I think what I think is it takes. I think we have some really great reporters on our team who look at it from every angle, not only just. And so all of that matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, this is the issue, right? Like, when I'm thinking about women reporters, usually it can also happen that they like the editors, maybe they want to put them in some boxes that if you're a woman, you need to present certain perspective, right? So how would you say, like, how you try to, like, overcome that? Because, like, this is the added value, of course, like when it comes to, for example, COVID coverage, like you're doing it right now. That this the perspective of the group which is discriminated, which has lower chances, like in terms of, like, surviving, or, like, I don't know, there is this economic inequality. So, like, this the person who knows about what she speaks about. This is a okay. I guess we have some connection problems. Are you here? So, yeah. Okay. Sorry, because it was a moment, but I guess I have you again.
Yeah. So, yes, we definitely see that happening. The only, and the only way to really rectify that is by really just being really adamant, knowing that you are the expert. So, for example, we did a story recently. We do many stories about childcare and the economy. And so, those stories that you see normally about it are about middle class families, you see in the US that are struggling working from home. And, one thing that obviously growing up in a different part, everybody's children that are running the businesses are women, are predominantly women of color, migrant, immigrant women. And so we pitched a story to a big paper, and and we said, okay, I think we need to do this side of the story. We've been doing a lot of stories about parents and families, but what about the immigrant women? What about the women of color they're actually the business women? They're actually, their businesses are being jeopardized. And the male editor, he's very nice, but he said to us, well, what about the parents? I mean, I'm at home with my kids, so why don't we cover this too? And that's been covered. And so, it was our responsibility then to really push back and say, this is why we need to do this. So, And you know, we were able to do a really successful story. It ended up being really widely read, and I haven't seen it covered to that depth anywhere else because we used a lot of data investigative work as well. And so, you know, I think that's sort of our role and our responsibility here.
Yeah, exactly. And like when it comes to the coverage, you already mentioned that you didn't see this particular topic to be picking up on somewhere else. So like, what do you think? Like, what stories are not covered but should be covered? Like, what are we missing apart from what you said? Like, could you elaborate on that?
I mean, I think, you know, I think we're getting there in terms of topics. But, you know, I think when we think of women, we look at the traditional topics and stories like domestic violence, like trafficking, you know, we look at reproductive health care. But, you know, they're part of every story. You know, they should be part of our climate coverage, our political coverage, our tech coverage, you know, identity. And so, I mean, I think it's just easy to think about women, you know, as part of like maybe a certain section, right? Or like a certain section of your newspaper or your radio station. But I mean, anywhere where you see men, there are stories about women.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when you see men, you don't distinguish that they should be featuring the stories which are about men or like some particular things dedicated to men, right? But it's somehow all the time with women, right? It's still like it's really troubling, I would say. So I would like to ask you how you're like again like digging a bit deeper, like in what you're doing, is how you're just breaking this cycle in terms of in terms of this coverage. So like about a bit about the process of your work. So like for example, how you're picking the stories.
So you know, we're very lucky because we have a lot of great journalists on the ground, and we're moving away from a model of, you know, us as editors as well, going and telling people, dictating the news cycle. We really rely on these really talented journalists on the ground to tell us what's happening. And, you know, we also partner a lot with like local newsrooms. So, for example, there's no way to know. I'll give you an example. One of our really wonderful global editors, she came to us with a story out of Nigeria that we're currently working on in Northwest Nigeria. And there's no way we would have had that story if we didn't have a really great journalist on the ground talking about reproductive health care. And, you know, so we worked with her to really, and partnered with her to bring that story to a U.S. and foreign audience, and so I think it's just really important to rely on the experts, and I think that's part of this all. I think it's also goes hand in hand with when we talk about gender, and we talk about how men are overrepresented in certain newsrooms, and so I think it's the same thing as when we talk about that in terms of representation in the kinds of people that are telling the stories. And so that's sort of a really big part of our process. And then the rest of it is just good journalism, right? Like everybody has their good sources, you're reading, you're doing your research. And a lot of the crux of our success is through our partnerships, whether they're with these local journalists or with local newsrooms or regional partners. And so I mean, that's really what we have to rely on, especially during COVID right now, right? When the first few months we couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't actually go to the place that you want to tell the story. You had to get creative. And so we had to get creative.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that's a great point because I already seen some questions about journalism during the COVID. So maybe you could tell us more. How do you operate during pandemic? I guess it's insightful.
That's a really good question. I think like every other newsroom, we're surviving. So at the beginning, and it's changed a little bit, but at the beginning, we were very much having to report, from our homes and getting creative. So we have really talented journalists who are really able to tell the story on the ground, get that color by talking to people on the phone, by Skyping with them, asking them to send pictures of snapshots of their days. And so it was a little bit more difficult. It needs a little bit more ingenuity. And then once we were able to send people out again, very carefully, we had to do a lot of thinking about how do we keep our team safe and our colleagues safe, and how do we take care of them? How do we look after them? And so we would send them with very particular, specific gear, protective gear. We did regular check-ins. We do regular check-ins. We ask them to stay, if they're covering, say something, we actually try not to send them to large crowds still, if there's a protest or a march. And so, I mean, reporting is still going on, right? It's just a little bit, it just has like a couple extra steps that we weren't taking before.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's also the, maybe not a chance, but like a bit challenging, but also can be a chance. Why not, like, to kind of reshape the work and collaboration with people on the ground, because you told me that you have a lot of partners all around the world. So it's not like that you're sending journalists based in the US, for example. You kind of like to find the links in the places, or journalists who are on the ground, who actually are insiders and know the story better. It's how it works. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So like one more question about it, like how you're selling the stories, because all of the stories, like in depth, really great reportages, as I've seen, were published in like big media outlets, right? And like maybe for the first time, some of these topics were tackled. So like these are like two questions actually, but I will start from the first, because I don't want to like throw too many questions at once. So firstly, like how you're presenting the story, how does it work, the cooperation with these big media outlets?
Well, so, a lot of us have worked at some of those outlets. Many of us have partnered with them ourselves. Many of us have pitched, I pitched a number of those outlets over my career as well. And so part of it is, maintaining a really good relationship with your editor, no matter who you are, even with us, if you have a really good repertoire and like you have a good conversation with your editor, and you can work well together, it leaves that door open. And so, but otherwise, like, but also the most important thing is we have a good story. And so what we do is we pitch it just like we pitch anything else, as you would pitch as a freelancer. And so but I think these gender story, like these stories that affect women. So we're not, sending over like breaking news stories. We're not sending over like the day after, but we're thinking about what is happening after, like some of these outlets are not thinking about like what's happening like day 5 or day 6 or day 7 of this story. And so we really presented to them that way. We're also staying away from like pitching like profiles, and like I said, breaking news. And so when you can give them like a clear gender angle, or like a really, really solid nut graph about what it is about this issue that is so important, not just to maybe this story, but regionally, nationally, and potentially even internationally, how can you resist? But
Yeah,
so a lot of it is about, having those really good relationships and not being, being bold in your storytelling, and also reaching out to some of these partners.
yeah, absolutely. So like talking about these topics which were not covered and should be covered, and actually the topics that you're picking up upon and covering. So like right now when you're working for the Fuller project, and also like during your whole career, like what do you see that has been missing from the mainstream coverage, that the topics that, or about what kind of topics you think that this should be like more widespread, and should be on like in biggest media outlets?
I mean, all of them. I think we're getting there. We are talking about, I think a lot of these larger outlets are trying, like they all have gender, like many of them have gender desks, but again, it's sort of, I mean, it's hard to say, because I think all of these stories should be about everything. Like, anytime you see any story, whether it's about, like right now, especially in the US, whether we're talking about politics or race or identity, or, inequality or criminal justice, they're all about, there's so many gender angles. Like, for example, if you look at criminal justice system in the US, which incarcerates such a large number of women, there's just so many stories that we don't see past, oh, this woman was imprisoned, and there are issues where there are systemic issues that we don't really cover. And so, for example, let me see if I can give you an example. We're looking right now at domestic violence, and how survivors of domestic violence are actually punished for for standing up for themselves, for fighting against abuse. And so many women have been imprisoned. And so it's just, there are things like that that you don't think about when you think about the criminal justice system and
Yeah.
how we can take an unconventional look at some of the topics that we always cover.
Mm-hmm. And during working at Fuller Project, have you encountered this feeling that you found that some story is so big and it should be covered, like there is like a big issue going on and nobody took a look on that? Like you were surprised, maybe some example, and that.
Well, I don't know if I can say nobody, but I think that I think we're all guilty, right? Like it's just easy to follow the easiest, like to fall into the trap of following the easiest thing that's closest to you, like low hanging fruit. But I think we're all making an effort, and even for us to some extent, it's also like about resources and really being able to think through stories. But that's why I think that's why you should have more women in your newsrooms.
Yeah. And what stories you think should be like more, like, for example, right now, what you think, like, what should be, what stories, what issues, like fundamental issues need a coverage right now, that maybe bigger
Okay.
coverage they have?
Well, definitely in the U.S., that's easy. I'll do it in two ways. I'll do the U.S. and the globe. So in the U.S., I think there are three stories right now that you can't ignore. One is COVID. One is politics. I don't think we can ignore that in the U.S. for the next month. And the third one is race. I think racial justice. And so right now, those are sort of at the center of everything that we do. Like I think for globally, especially, like if it's not we're in a time where we actually have one thing that affects everybody, right, globally, and that's what we all have in common, which is coronavirus. We are actually all experiencing or being affected by the same thing. So that's one. I think, and because of that, globally, I think that impacts, and we should look at like migration. It impacts violence against, like stories around violence against women. We're obviously seeing huge increases. I think there's a big story to do. There's a big story around tech and gender, especially around this and coronavirus, that we should be looking at. Reproductive health care, obviously a lot, even though coronavirus is huge, we should be looking at environment and climate change as well, and gender. There's a lot of natural disasters and other things, and the climate that are affecting women very heavily. So again, I could go on and on, really, almost in every topic.
Absolutely, especially like when it comes to climate change, for example, we sometimes are not fully aware of the fact that it really is connected strictly to gender, like, and this impact on women. So I'm really happy that you're also talking about it and mentioning and writing about it at the Fuller Project. I would like to slightly change the subject and ask you about your career and your beginning, actually, because you started in Afghanistan. So I wanted to ask what brought you there, like, yeah, what topics, like how did it work? How did it go? Yeah.
So I went to Afghanistan when I was 24. It was my first real job. I had just spent like my entire education studying about what was, again, women and how they were being impacted and affected by conflict and the world around them. And at that point, it was, it just seemed very obvious to me to go to Afghanistan and really understand, like, to look at the bigger picture, to look at the broader world. And so I did something a little bit different at the start of my career. I worked for an Afghan media company where I worked with 24 Afghan men. And so and we worked together in the field. It was a little bit different than going in with a larger company because my security situation was a little bit different. I could travel. I could take a normal car across town if I was there. And so I really got to speak to a lot of people. I got to be on the ground, really, instead of in a compound, I took commercial flights. So like when I would do my research, I would get off the plane and get into a car and go cover a story. And so it was a little bit different for me, and maybe not as secure as maybe it should have been. But yeah, it was, at that time, it was at the height of like all the media coverage in the US and around the world. So there were a lot of journalists there, a lot. And again, if I look back on it now, they were mostly male and white from from Europe and the US.
Surprisingly.
And yeah. And if I look at it now, and and if I think about it, you really made me think about this. I haven't thought about this in a long time. Um, it was a really sexist environment. They all shared sources. They would cover for each other if they were covering a story for like their big outlet, and so it was hard. And there were stories that I was seeing that they were not seeing, that they definitely did not cover at those outlets. And so it really taught me to be a little bit more resilient, to really value, as women, and as a woman of color, like our, the strength in our perspective, because I definitely was able to see things that they were not able to see, and also have access to people that they were not able to have access to, and you think about, as a woman, like who you can talk to in Kabul or in Herat or anywhere else in Afghanistan. You actually have more opportunities to actually really learn what people are going through and what are the stories that we need to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And what stories you cover there? Like maybe some examples?
So, I mean, at that point, we were talking about a lot about counterinsurgency, um, development, U.S.'s role in creating this like bubble of an economy, and I worked on sort of the research and media research development side of media, and so we did some really interesting things, like we were able to bring. I worked on the team that brought Sesame Street to Afghanistan, the media company. We would, we did. I was at the company that brought like the Afghan version of 24 to Afghanistan. We did Afghan Idol, so it was a little bit more of an entertainment and media job rather than like pure journalism. But it was a really, really great insight into being able to do things that were not all doom and gloom about a place
Yeah.
that people only want to cover when something bad happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And how this, like you already mentioned a bit, but I would like to refer to that once again, about your collaboration. Like you said that you collaborated with this like 25 Afghan men, or like a lot. And so how did it work with them, and also with this journalists in the field who were like European journalists and so on? Like for you.
It was, I can tell you, like, I working in Afghanistan was a challenge. I think it was definitely a challenge for me, as I was very young. Um, I also was leading a team. And so I think it was hard. It's a different culture. I come from, obviously, also a non-traditional, like, come from another immigrant culture as well. Like, my parents are Indian. And so, I had a little bit of like that cultural understanding to navigate, the environment. But again, I will say it was really hard for some of the Afghan men to um, take direction, from me. And so, and a lot of them, they were very nice and they meant really well. They were very like well-meaning, but one of them said, well, I can't listen to you. You look like my daughter. It doesn't, I can't. And then there would be like white women who were maybe only a little bit older than me that they would listen to, and they're like, yes, of course, let me do this. But so, for me, it was a very unique and specific experience that I don't think a lot of people had. And I think the same thing with being around a lot of male journalists. I remember, asking a few times, like, oh, I would love to cover this story for whatever outlet, international outlet. If you're going on vacation, I'll do it. And they would always be like, no. I'm just going to give it to the other male reporter,
Yeah.
that wasn't even asking about it. And, and so I think with the Fuller Project, and now being in a different position, many, many years later, is that I want to provide those opportunities to women that, maybe I didn't get early in my career, that, where I see the gaps, where I've seen the gaps throughout my career. And so I mean, I hope that's something that we are also doing behind the scenes and not just on, like I said, on paper, on radio, or, on TV.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to Afghanistan, it was like why Afghanistan in the first place, maybe?
Well, it was just I was fascinated by like what a really complex, important geopolitically, socioeconomically country that it was, and then how it was at the center of all of these conflicts, and and why it was like why it was such a sought after and like complex like conflict zone, and how it gone through like just decades and decades of war and at the hands
Yeah.
of external forces. And so and to see such a resilient, I really had wanted to really understand like what was happening and how it had impacted and affected the people who had lived there, who've only and many like young women and children who had only grown up with that view of their country.
Yeah, absolutely. I see. Like one question, actually, it would be nice. Like, any tips for aspiring female journalists? I guess like this is the very very perfect person to answer this question. So
I would say, don't be shy in reaching out to people that you admire, and asking for advice. I did that actually before I went to before I went to the Middle East, when I went to the West Bank. I reached out to somebody that I really admired. I emailed him actually, and he called me and gave me feedback. That was 12 years ago, and I still remember that. So I say, and now as there are more and more women that are leading the industry, right, and rising to the top, I would say reach out to them, ask them for 30 minutes of their time, come with specific questions, and when you can, even if you are sort of up and coming, I would say, even if say it's your first job in news or in journalism, pass it forward, like be able to mentor and help interns maybe, and younger people than you. um, Always be willing to learn. I started off my career in television, but I also, I made sure that I was always learning. I kept writing while I was doing that. I experimented a little bit with radio. I learned how to shoot. And so I would say, just keep pushing and just keep fighting.
okay. And also like when it comes to fuller project that you guys aim to embrace women journalists, especially, which is amazing and great. Do you see that women journalists sometimes are a bit reserved when it comes to pitching, or maybe not, I don't know, confident enough? Like when you're working with women journalists, how do you see it? Like some
I
struggles?
think it's just I think most journalists who are not at big, like who are not already employed and are they're trying to pitch, everybody's a little bit nervous, right? Because you always want to make
Yeah.
sure that your pitch is like good. So I don't know if it's like, I don't think it's a thing about like just women in particular. I think it's just everybody, like freelancers in general, to be honest.
Yeah, okay. Like following your career further, I wanted to ask you about your experience in Latin America, especially Mexico. Like in this, I tend to not to generalize stuff, but let's say patriarchal structure, society, and machismo omnipresent, right? Omnipresent. Sorry, a bit of French. Omnipresent there. So how did you operate there? Like how was it for you, especially when it comes to topics that you cover, which is like inequality, gender related issue, and so on?
Well, I think it's a little bit different for me because as a foreigner, um, I didn't have the same circumstances as I think a lot of really brave Mexican journalists had. I think this, that Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries for a journalist, I think, right after
Yeah.
Syria. And so I won't put myself in that category. There's definitely a different level of fear and danger for journalists from Mexico to do their job. But I would say, for me, it was, I always had to have, in certain cases, like I had to have a male colleague come with me, just in case, especially when I was meeting sources that I was a little bit uncertain about, I had met before in person, which I haven't done in other places, especially, and so, or for example, I would meet somebody, like, for example, let me give you an example. I covered the Mexico earthquake in 2017. There was a 7.1 magnitude earthquake that destroyed much of Mexico City. And a lot of it was under construction and people were stuck under the rubble. And so the Mexican military was helping out. And so I would have to reach out to some of the people in the military on the ground as I was like, trying to get into areas
Mm-hmm.
where, people were trapped. And, I made a good few contacts. And then all of a sudden, I heard from, like, I would start hearing from one of my sources all the time. And he's like, we should meet up. I was like, well, I don't need a story from you. I'm okay. Thank you so much. And he would say to me, I'm going to go inside, actually. And I'm going to go inside. And actually,
Okay.
he said to me,
Yeah, it's live.
yeah,
Anything can happen.
sorry, Katia. Yeah,
No, no
sorry.
problem. It's live.
I know. And so he would say to me, well, why don't we meet up? I know where you, and I would say, I'm fine. Thank you so much. And he said to me, well, I know where you live. And at that time, that's really terrifying. I was living by myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I was living without, like, most expats or foreigners will live with like security, and like a door
Mm-hmm.
and more security.
Yeah.
And I was living in a very old building. And, I remember it was like 8 o'clock on a Sunday night. And I was like, okay, is he going to show up here? What am I going to do? And so, it's just some of these sources, some of these situations that I don't think that men have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, again, I would not put myself at anywhere near the level of danger that Mexican journalists have to deal with and the kind of stories they tell and they cover. But again, as a woman just trying to do my job, it was just a very difficult experience.
Yeah, like apparently women who just want to do their job sometimes are too much for some certain people or men, let's say. So yeah, we need to deal with that and like trying to make this better. I wanted to jump a bit to reporting on women and like coverage on women because this is also like one of the pillars of the filler project to sort of reshape it. How we also like shortly talked about it before. So where do you see the problems like women are presented and maybe some kind of and what as the fuller project and as like your team and so on, how you try to sort of change it to make it maybe more fair, more equal?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. And I would say, when we talk about this, again, I think we really have to look at ourselves as the industry as a whole and how, not only what we're doing and how we're telling the story, but who is able to tell that story and who is sort of setting the tone for the kind of stories that we tell. And I think, Katia, that like, as you've seen in the US in the summer, there's been a reckoning in the media, right? About, okay, are the people that are covering the stories are representative of the communities and the world that we live in? And like, I think we all pretty much know we can agree that the answer is no. And I think that also is not only an issue of race, but also of gender. When you have at the highest levels, you have newsrooms dominated by very powerful men, it's almost inevitable that you're not going to see these stories covered about women, in every aspect. And maybe that's why to certain degrees, like they're stuck in like you said, the entertainment or culture or like certain, gender parameters. And so I think that's one big thing. I think having, again, not only like the issue of gender, but like having people who are representative of the communities that they cover those communities is very, very important. As we mentioned, I think the way we talk about women, and so like the way we like, as we mentioned again, how we describe women, the words we use, especially in our reporting, that's very important. And how we also like describe the women in our stories.
So actually, like how should we? How do you think we should we?
Well,
describe?
it depends on the story, right? So if we're talking about like, let's say we're talking about trafficking or domestic violence, as we were talking about earlier, I think one really I think one common thing that many people do is that they will use the word victim to talk about the women, that are maybe assaulted or abused, and like that's a simple fix. Like the the word that we should be thinking about and the way we should be thinking about women is really survivor.
Absolutely.
Because you're framing it again when you're calling the woman a victim from the perspective of the man, right? And so I think part of that also, what we're also looking at then when we're looking at all these issues is also who are the people that we're talking to that are the experts that can tell you this, tell you about the topic that you're covering. And so we also make it I'm going to go outside again now because like the experts that you're talking to, it's also very important. And I think, and so we really look, if we're covering a story about health and gender, climate and gender, or anything else, we really look for experts that can speak to that as women.
Yeah, absolutely. Expert, not like kind of the part of the background who is always a victim, or like, like this very emotional baggage, which is always like follows the women in stories. I guess this is crucial. As for like our last topic, I guess, like that I would like to touch upon and like talk about is race. You write about a lot about racial injustice and structural racism and so on. And you also like I read also that you tweeted that diversity in media does not exist yet, and I agree with you. It's hard to disagree actually. when we just see with our own eyes what's going on. So I would like to ask you about the role of race in journalism. As you're an expert, like you're close to this issue, like if there are like your observations like about. Oh, sorry, my phone just got blocked. It's like live thing, but I'm back. Did you hear my question like about this racial injustice in the industry? Yeah. Okay, I'm back.
Yeah, it's a really broad question. I can start with, so there are two ways, right? I think it sort of feeds back into when we were talking about gender and representation, about who's telling the stories. And I think, there's a lot of education like that we all still need to cover racial justice. I think, it's something that is not only plaguing obviously the media industry, but also us as a community, as a country here in the US. And I think there are other countries going through the same kind of reckoning. And I think one really simple way is like your diversity, representation, equality, inclusion in your newsrooms really matter. And I think, and even just, and still, that's number one, right? Like we need the people who really understand these stories to be a part of these stories, to tell these stories, to help us tell them, because I mean, as you can see, we've been doing it, like the way we've been doing it clearly has not been working. Then number two, I think, is that I think a lot of people, they're looking at this and they're making a quick fix. And, they're thinking about race and inequality, and they're like, okay, well, we'll just start, like, we'll hire a reporter to cover that. That's great. We'll just create a beat for this. But I think what's really important is that, like, we have to understand that racial injustice and inequality is a part of everything and everyday life. Like, just like we're talking about gender, it's, there are systemic issues with our healthcare system in the US. There's systemic issues with access to reproductive health care for women around the world. There are systemic issues around environmental justice and criminal justice and social justice and everything else, access to water, politics, and so I think the way that we're looking at it, the Fuller Project, is that we're folding in that coverage and that conversation into every beat and every topic. When we have reporters look at certain stories, like whether it's trafficking or domestic violence or politics or anything else, childcare and the economy and labor, we have them look at the fundamental inequalities that are happening within that topic, not only that topic, but that story, rather than being like, let's have a separate conversation about race over here.
I get it. It just needs to be included. And when it comes to racial discrimination in the industry, like for journalists, especially women journalists.
Yeah, I
know it's a tough one.
I can only speak from my experience, but I think we can all agree that I think we can see that there is a lack of representation. I've never, there are a few really wonderful, really, really amazing, talented women that I can look up to, but they're growing, you have like your like Stacey Marie Ishmaels, you have your Lydia Paul Greens, you have, your Mitra Kalidas, like who are these really, really strong, like Black and brown women really forging ahead for us. And I'm just hoping that, you know, hopefully 10, 15, 20 years from now, that we'll have even more, and that new journalists coming in will be like, okay, this is great. Like now there's not just 5 of them, but there's 100 of them that are leading these newsrooms, and it'll be a different place.
Yeah, but like right now, would you say that that's like a tough issue, like especially because the journalism and the industry is like white male dominated, as we already mentioned a few times. So firstly, it's difficult for women to actually go with the story and not being subjected to some kind of a stereotype following her, but also like for women of color. So like how like it's I get
yeah.
Mhm.
No, I understand. We have a long way to go. Yeah, I still think there's a long way to go. I think, and I think we're all reckoning with that. I think all these newsrooms are trying to address it, and hopefully, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But to your question, to answer it directly, yeah, I do think we have a long way to go. But we're making a start.
Yeah, we're making a start. I hope it will go like better, and we will finally have some diversity, because like the issue is that diversity became some kind of a slogan which like everybody refers to, but nobody actually puts it into practice, mostly for advertisement, for the sake of advertisement maybe. So yes, I really hope that it will be better. So any maybe final comments on that, on racial injustice in the industry, like for women of color, women of color in journalism? You would like to add something more?
Well, I would just say, you know, just as it's everybody's responsibility, you know, I'm always in that vein. I do take, you know, take ownership as somebody who's very lucky to be in this position, that if you are, you know, a Black or brown woman, you can feel free, just like anybody else, to reach out to me and to anyone else. And you should always feel free to, you have every right, I guess I would say to those women, that you have every right to be here just like everybody else. And definitely it might take a little bit longer, but you have every resource. And you can always reach out to me or email me.
Yeah. So if any aspiring women journalists are watching us right now or watch us later, like feel free to contact Khusbu and see how it will go later, right? Like why not, the more the merrier, right? Like we really need more society. Absolutely. Thank you, Khusbu, so much for today. It was really lovely, and I'm still very jealous that it's such a nice weather on your end. So thank you so much, and have a lovely day. Thank you, guys.
You too.
Thank you for watching. Bye.